harvested from responsibly sourced ingredients. This is the Daniel Natal Show. In Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, she has 7 suggestions for making a more sustainable economic system. Suggestion number 4 is, get savvy with systems. The iconic crisscross of the market supply and demand curves is the first diagram that every economics student encounters, but it is rooted in misplaced 19th century metaphors of mechanical equilibrium. A far smarter starting point for understanding the economy's dynamism is systems thinking, summed up by a simple pair of feedback loops. Of course, here she's referring to cybernetics, what's now known as systems theory, in which any system can be controlled with recourse to positive and negative inputs to create a feedback loop. Think of the ones and zeros of binary code. The 1 is a positive feedback input, and the 0 is a negative feedback input. By setting up an algorithm with these nudges, you can create a system which can self-correct, like your air conditioning system, for instance, which is a cybernetic system, using a sensor, the thermostat, to set up an ideal temperature, after which negative and positive feedbacks are instituted to keep the system in balance. At any rate, you can get more of a grasp of cybernetics in Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems. In it, she complains about the habit of linear thinking. Reality isn't linear, it's exponential. It's a loop, not a straight line. All systems by definition repeat. If it doesn't repeat, it's not a system. Even government is a system with repetitions. The Constitution, for instance, is a sort of paper algorithm telling us that every 2 years a congressman is elected, every 6 years a senator, every 4 years a president. This is a repetition, a cycle. Traditions in your country are a system. We celebrate the 4th of July every year, or Thanksgiving. It repeats annually in a cycle. According to historians William Strauss and Neil Howe, in their book, The Fourth Turning, we've gotten used to linear thinking since the Industrial Revolution. Before then, our ancestors thought of history as cyclical. After all, their conception of time in the agrarian period was based on astronomical cycles that helped them in farming. So just as spring, summer, fall, and winter repeated, they were aware that certain historical cycles repeated. After the Industrial Revolution, the watchword of the West was progress. We believed less in cycles than in straight-line evolution, where everything went forward in a straight line, bigger and better. Here's the problem, though. If you're unaware of cycles and how they repeat, how can you learn from the past? The answer is, you can't. And this is why a linear conception of history is dangerous, and why books like Francis Fukuyama's The End of History are ridiculous. Anyone who tells you to ignore the lessons of the past and that the present is unlike any other time period in history is doing you a disservice. They're shrinking your time horizon down to about 3 seconds like a goldfish. Nevertheless, this sort of thinking has largely taken over. Take Selwyn Duke's penetrating article in the New American Magazine called Canceling Cancel Culture. In it, we read, in 212 BC, 460 scholars were cancelled, permanently, when Emperor Qin Shi Huang had them buried alive for owning forbidden books. The Qin, who had united China, made the argument, we don't want to hear people criticize the present by referring to the past, Harvard University Chinese history professor Peter Bohl told the BBC in 2012. The past is irrelevant. History is irrelevant. And so you have the burning of books. You have the burying of scholars, of scholarly critics. These people who tell you not to study the past, and who are telling you not to look at the past, are trying to dumb you down, trying to make you incapable of avoiding the mistakes of history. Like that quote from George Santayana, those who do not learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. And repeat it, we are. Which brings us to our second story. Look at Selwyn Duke's article. It's about censorship and blacklisting. That's nothing new. I remember as a kid, one of the first books I read as a teenager was The Front. About what I was told was the 1950s McCarthyite Red Witch Hunt. The book gave a highly biased and humanizing face to the communist subversives who were trying to overthrow the United States at the time. Hollywood even made a propaganda film about it.
What if there was a list? A list that said our finest actors weren't allowed to act. Our best writers weren't allowed to write. Our funniest comedians weren't allowed to make us laugh. What would this country be like if there was such a list? It would be like America in 1953.
Fairy tales can come true. It can happen to you if you're young at heart.
We are investigating the communist conspiracy in the entertainment world.
In 1953, there was such a list, and some of this man's friends were on it.
Mr. Prince, do you know Alfred Miller?
Howard, they won't buy my scripts. I'm on a blacklist, you know.
You want to put my name on your scripts?
I write the scripts. I send them in under your name. They buy the scripts, right? It's perfect.
I like how the film starts in 1953. By 1960, however, the so-called Hollywood blacklist was over. We read on Wikipedia's article on the blacklist. The blacklist lasted until 1960, when Dalton Trumbo, a Communist Party member from 1943 to 1948 and member of the Hollywood 10, was credited as the screenwriter of the film Exodus and publicly acknowledged by actor Kirk Douglas for writing the screenplay for Spartacus. So the so-called dread Hollywood blacklist lasted from 1953 to 1960? 7 years? And it only affected a small handful of people? Compare the brief duration of that blacklist to the incomparably longer blacklisting of conservatives, which wasn't a few years, but lasted half a century now. Look at how back in the 1970s, people were being blacklisted by the radical left. When you look up the movie Network, for instance, you find this anecdote. The director Lumet wanted to cast Vanessa Redgrave in the film, but the writer Paddy Chayefsky didn't want her. Lumet argued that he thought she was the greatest English-speaking actress in the world, while Chayefsky, a proud Jew and supporter of Israel, objected on the basis of her support for the PLO. Lumet, also a Jew, said, "Paddy, that's blacklisting," to which Chayefsky replied, "Not when a Jew does it to a Gentile." This happened as well in 1982 to actor Dwight Schultz, best known for his role on the TV show The A-Team. He originally tried out for the medical drama St. Elsewhere, but was blacklisted for his conservative beliefs by the show's producer, Bruce Paltrow. On his Wikipedia page we read, Paltrow was a Democrat. He reportedly refused to cast Dwight Schultz for a role on St. Elsewhere because the actor, a political conservative, supported Ronald Reagan. The point is, the blacklisting of conservatives has lasted longer than the vastly smaller blacklisting of the Hollywood 10 for a few years in the 1950s. The current blacklisting also has a vastly larger footprint. It doesn't just entail a handful of Hollywood writers. It encompasses average citizens being deplatformed and fired from their jobs. It goes from the smallest hot dog vendor now up to the President of the United States himself, when Trump was banned from Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The scope of and length of what has happened to patriotic Americans dwarfs anything that happened in the 1950s. But will there be any movies humanizing the victims? Will there be textbook entries in your kids' school books about the dark period of censorship and authoritarianism that placed a dark cloud over America after the cultural Marxist takeover? Or were we expected not to learn from history? Let's leave off where we started and complete the loop, because that's where this presentation began, with explaining how history is cyclical, and not just history, but systems. All systems repeat. They create repetitions. Like I said before about how the Constitution is a paper algorithm setting up cycles that repeat in the government, or how holidays and traditions are cultural habits per se. In the aforementioned book, Thinking in Systems, Donella Meadows warns that you're not going to get change by voting in a single charismatic politician. This isn't about individuals. It's about systems. She writes, "If you don't change the system, you won't change anything. Americans, it just may be time to change the system." The elites stink. They hate it when we push their buttons. Help us to push their buttons by pushing our buttons, the like and subscribe buttons. Also, don't forget about thenewamerican.com. Think of the magazine less as a newspaper than as a newspaper. You know, like the Greek nous, knowledge. Note to self, multilingual Greek puns don't work.